Hello, everyone. So my name is Dorothy. I will let Merlin introduce himself, but just to preface, we're coming to you from two civic tech nonprofits in Canada, Code for Canada and Open North. I'm Dorothy, the Executive Director of Code for Canada. I'll pass it to Merlin first, and then we'll divvy it up and do the organizational background. Merlin, we didn't discuss that, but go ahead.
Sure. Thanks. I'm Merlin. I'm the Executive Director for Open North. Yeah. You want to do a Code for Canada intro then?
Yeah, sure.
Sure.
So Code for Canada, we're a national nonprofit that aims to build the digital capacity of governments across Canada through our various programs and services that generally fall into a couple different services and offerings. Those are product delivery, digital capacity training, as well as user testing, inclusive usability testing. We run a variety of different programs and services, as I mentioned. We're headquartered in Toronto, Ontario. In Toronto, we have a program called Civic Hall, where we've engaged with a number of different municipal government teams to work on projects and better understand their digital capacity building challenges and needs. We also run a digital capacity building program called the Fellowship, where we essentially embed teams of technology and design professionals, most of them largely coming from the private sector, embedding them within government to not only deliver help their government partners deliver a new digital product or service, but also basically act as coaches in helping their government teams to understand and better apply the kind of digital principles and methodologies that are fairly common in the private sector in building like software in the tech sector. So yeah, a lot of our work revolves around this kind of coaching model and like essentially modeling the behaviors that we hope that government teams are able to observe and adopt, and then build that kind of confidence and long-term capacity building. So yeah, it's from all these experiences of working with different government teams across Canada, especially at the municipal level, especially also through our Civic Hall program, that we have learned a couple things about what works and what doesn't work when it comes to digital transformation on the ground and kind of like day-to-day settings. Especially with groups that face resource constraints like smaller governments, municipal governments. So that's a bit about Code for Canada. I'll pass it over to Merlin.
Thank you. And so yeah, Open North, also a nonprofit situated in the civic technology digital transformation space, working with public, private, and research partners, as well as directly with communities to foster effective, responsible, and collaborative use of data and technology to solve complex problems. And I think that's really sort of the ethos of Open North right now is how do we take some of these normative concepts of digital transformation and open data and smart cities and really apply them in a meaningful way to tangible problems that people are facing. We use an integrated approach, so we do applied research and publications off of that research, capacity building directly one-on-one support services to cities, and then solution design and network facilitation. Often the best learning comes from cities working with each other. So much of our organizational experience in this space comes from our role as the lead technical partner for the Community Solutions Network, and that's a INFC Infrastructure Canada funded program that emerged out of Canada's Smart City Challenge. So through that, Open North works with the City of Montreal as they implement their city plan. We supported Bridgewater. Those were the two winning cities within the Smart Cities Challenge. And then the Community Solutions Network was designed for those applicants that didn't win, but to try and sustain the momentum and provide ongoing support. And yeah, I think maybe the one other thing is we have a series we have an LMS, a learning management system that has a number of courses. So any of these concepts that we're talking about around open data or digital transformation, smart cities, there's introductory and above courses that can be found at the Open North website. So with that, I'll pass it back to Dorothy.
Okay, so Merlin and I just wanted to start out with a quick story, just to set the stage and provide some context as to why we're all here. So this is an image back from March 2020. This is when COVID was declared a pandemic and everybody was ordered to stay home across the country and around the world. You know, when I was preparing these slides, I was thinking, well, this is a time, like, do we all remember that? And like, oh, that was not fun. And it seems like we might be even revisiting this same kind of scenario again, but I will not actually acknowledge that or talk about it because it's too depressing. But anyways, going back to this incident or this period of time, everybody was required to shelter en masse. Meanwhile, governments and public servants were mobilizing to confront all the impacts of COVID-19 that were affecting, the public. So all of a sudden, very quickly, governments were really thrust into the spotlight as different communities needed urgent supports, and they were all turning to their governments for answers. And what we were noticing is that a lot of governments didn't necessarily have the resources to address these urgent supports. The ones that were lucky enough to kind of like have the resources and the budgets to keep up and actually respond to the public's needs. And so some of those needs that just to help illustrate and remind us of the realities are like, everything from like reporting daily case numbers of COVID, urgently shifting resources like PPE and ventilators across the country, making sure all our grocery store shelves were stocked because everyone was buying toilet paper, even to like making sure like Canadians abroad could get back home safely, which turned out to be like the largest repatriation effort in our national history. These are just, a very broad sample of different tasks that governments were thrown at governments and were required to keep up with in order to keep our like communities and societies running in ways that none of us could have really predicted like six months before that. And so meanwhile, like, labor markets went haywire because no one was going out. Entire industries were slammed, a lot of people.
455.
Nope. A lot of people were out of work, and so the federal government had to process millions of financial assistance claims, and at some point was receiving like 1,000 claims per minute. So we here, at Code for Canada, actually at the time, Merlin, who is now with Open North, was formerly with Code for Canada, and we were kind of watching it all unfold. And a few of us in the digital government community wanted to help because we kind of considered ourselves familiar with these, digital service challenges that governments were unexpectedly needing to deal with due to COVID. So we decided to throw our weight behind them and, help governments move at the speed of need during the pandemic. And so we had a hypothesis that especially teams in small governments, and so that means, small or minimally resourced teams, AKA municipalities, had, this urgent need to support residents and businesses, but a lot of them were bogged down by traditional government IT procurements and development cycles. So we were, so that was our hypothesis, and decided to start there with trying to provide supports to smaller governments. So as a result, we spun up a pilot program called Open Call. This was a pro bono technical support and capacity building program for government teams, especially teams in small governments. And the program was designed to help, municipal teams basically like quickly deploy digital solutions to common challenges that were presented by COVID. And it did that by what we did was we kind of like curated a catalog of open source tools and like short-term supports from the civic tech community. So these are the communities that Code for Canada, supports and works closely with. They're groups of volunteers who often have technical and design backgrounds who want to help. And so we engage the civic tech community to, help take this catalog of tools, deploy the tools, develop new ones, essentially just take these shareable solutions to help governments in need. The pilot was a collaboration between the Canadian Digital Service, the Digital Academy at the Canada School of Public Service, and Code for Canada. And it really took inspiration from two existing initiatives that were popping up in the United States around COVID. One was the US digital response, which connected governments with digital professionals who want to contribute to public sector efforts related to the pandemic. The other initiative is the New America's Pandemic Response Repository, which was this list of open source tools, developed with, by, and for governments. So this was our kind of response, our signal of throwing our weight behind, a large problem that we thought was that was happening. So what happened as a result? Well, it's safe to say that smaller governments were not knocking down our door to access these free services. And though there wasn't a great way to track how many people downloaded, code from our catalog, we didn't really receive that many indications that our catalog was even being used or looked at. For the support, we had extensive vetting processes to make sure that we were prioritizing our resources to projects that were best fit, and instead we had to go and actually start going out and recruiting governments to work with. And in that process of trying to recruit governments and getting them to pay attention and figuring out how we can help them, what we found was that smaller governments want to offer more digital services, but they seem to be unsure of who to turn to for advice in scaling down products and processes that they've seen employed by larger and more well-resourced governments. So this kind of led to most of our requests within Open Call being for hands-on support rather than this kind of supplementary training and coaching that the pilot was designed around. So that story kind of revealed a lesson for us, this story of launching Open Call. And the data that came out that invalidated our hypothesis, we wanted to just dig in more. And so we wanted to also figure out how to better support smaller governments and really get to know the challenges that are preventing them from leveraging digital solutions. So we went upstream from the problem. And really what it led us was to this larger question of just in order for governments to perhaps better leverage digital technologies and create more digital responsive user-centric services, they likely need to have their own internal digital capacity to enable that. But the question then becomes does every government need to have its own digital team? We've seen a lot of governments around the world, especially larger governments, even many in Canada, like the federal government. Based in Ontario, so the Ontario government has their own digital service teams, but that's not really accessible, not always accessible for smaller governments that are less resourced. So if not every government needs to have a digital team, then how digital do they need to be? Go ahead, Merlin.
Thanks. And this is where we take a bit of a step back and recognize that our story and our learning and the catalyst for this was really COVID. COVID didn't create these digital capacity gaps. They've already existed. But the fact that they existed caused many of these governments to shut down during the pandemic. And there was no escaping the fact that governments were not equipped to manage their affairs in a virtual environment. And so there's a bit of a catalyst here. And there's been a whole variety of responses and looking at, so what is the best response? And is that sort of going all in on digital? And looking at some of these existing maturity models and sort of striving to be a complete digital team, or have a complete digital team, or have digital teams within each ministry. Like we said, it's probably not accessible for everyone. And the question is it even necessary? Next slide. And so some of the responses that we see demonstrate that, and especially through Open Call, is that many of these smaller governments, less resource governments, were not advanced enough in digital terms to even to respond to a service like Open Call or know what specific support they needed. They don't know where to begin or how to properly identify the problems or the barriers that were keeping them from being solved. So what we see is that the lack of internal capacity that necessitates external purchases and or contracting is the same lack of internal capacity that makes these processes difficult and risky. And so what governments are starting to recognize is that policy or business analysts can't be expected to also be user experience researchers. They can't be expected to be developers, product managers without specific training and experience. And so what we're seeing as sort of one end of this in a negative way is that it leads to governments handing over the diagnosis and prescription to private firms and external experts. And we all know stories at all levels of government where the promises to solve problems actually lead to long-term legacy contracts, poor services, and massive failures. And so when we're posing this question of how digital do you need to be, we're looking at how do we avoid these epic and long-term failures. And that doesn't mean that the solution is bringing everything in-house. What it means is that we need to understand what the trigger is. We need to understand what the context is, and then we can do the capacity assessment to see where the current capacity is within the context that would dictate whether there needs to be investment in capacity building and in-house development, internal development, and or the proper contracting and procurement. So when we look at triggers, what I want to sort of emphasize here is, global pandemic, an obvious trigger, a massive, large-scale trigger, requiring a larger scale response in a lot of ways. A mandate from mayor and council for digital transformation or smart city strategies. Again, broad, large trigger requiring an analysis across many different departments, an integrated approach. A shift in the status quo that requires a digitalization of a manual process could be a smaller problem that is the catalyst. A digital champion, somebody who's just interested in it, sees a place for more effective service delivery or engagement of residents. And then external pressure from residents, community associations saying, this city that is right next to us has this process and this really works well for them. Why do we not do something like that? So then we move from triggers to context, and there's a whole contextual analysis is a whole thing. And I won't bore you with it today, but we really need to know the context within which we're working. So is there political involvement or support? Does that exist? Because without that knowledge, without that support, a lot of things, a lot of actions, and a lot of transformation initiatives are really limited. Is there a current smart city or digital transformation strategy that these initiatives would need to fit within, or something that gives them cover, gives them justification? What available resources? Are there resources that are dedicated directly to this transformation? Scope and scale. Are we talking about across the municipality, across the government transformation, or are we talking about within a department, within looking at a specific problem? Recent change projects, is there a line in the annual budget, population size, municipal staff? We talk about municipalities that have under 100 staff. Then you consider that when you're thinking, okay, do we need an interdisciplinary or a multidisciplinary digital team that would be 3, 4, 5 staff with that ratio of staff? Does that actually make sense? And then commonalities with similar municipal challenges. And so what I was trying to show in this one, in my very fancy lines, when you take your triggers and your context, it tells you it gives you an indication of where the capacity needs to be, how large the problem will be. And so if you look at like the global pandemic with political support, we've seen a lot of actually surprisingly rapid movement and digitalization of services because there's a clear trigger, there's clear political support, the budget is sort of just made to be there. Whereas if we look at a digital champion that doesn't actually have an availability of resources, the scale of capacity necessary and the scale of transformation will be a lot smaller. And so then there's a required sequencing in order to invest in the changes that will leverage or unlock other additional changes. And the last one, one of the things we see frequently is we see a mandate from mayor and council for something like this, a smart city strategy or digital transformation, but there's no budget line put in. So it's we want to be known as somebody who has a smart city, but we're just going to pull from existing budget lines to say these are smart, this is digital, we're transforming here, this is the change we're trying to see. So we asked this question, and by knowing how digital you need to be, helps you understand how to plan your transformation initiatives. What's the scale? What's the budget? What's the political support? Should your digital products be developed in-house or outsourced, which impacts the amount of capacity you need to build internally? Do you have the in-house capacity to product manage a development process? Who's going to ensure users are at the center? Right, so planning for these transformation initiatives between internal and external capacities. Hiring decisions, and how to make future-looking hiring decisions. Do you even have these positions within your collective agreements? Are there, is a product developer, is a product manager, do those positions exist? Often they don't. And do you have the in-house capacity for this? Should you have the capacity? If you hired all of these necessary positions or skills for this particular transformation initiative that has this global pandemic as a catalyst, as a trigger, what do you do after that? What do you do with these people? Is there a plan for continuing to use them? And then knowing how to make smarter tech purchasing decisions. And this we're looking at how to not get stuck into legacy, how to be able to procure and insist in a modular build, so that if you need to add or want to add more modules later, you can, and then deciding whether those modules could be built in-house or could you get another external vendor to do it. So making sure that the contracts and the agreements that are being signed allow for this flexibility.
Great. Okay, so we are going to dive in and actually start to apply these areas of understanding triggers, context into what we hope to see eventually as our kind of unified understanding of an organization's digital capacity. So the next part of this webinar is going to be interactive again. There's going to be another kind of Mentimeter poll. But before I do that, I'm going to quickly kind of walk you through, provide you some context that the rest of the polling is going to be based on. So on this slide, we have two different kind of personas of organizations, public sector organizations. And so we've called them scenario A and scenario B, not super creative, but we will be using these two scenarios to kind of like walk through the next pillars of digital characteristics, or digital capacity that is kind of like, and getting your input on how important each of those characteristics are within each of these organizations with respect to their own triggers and contexts, and then also better understanding your input of whether what's kind of the minimum threshold of internal capacity that's required in order for an organization like scenario A or scenario B to engage with an external vendor or seek external support. So scenario A is an upper tier municipality with 5 to 9 lower tier municipalities within it. In this case, this organization is required to respond to a provincial mandate for COVID symptom tracking. And specifically, the problem that they're looking at is needing to digitize a manual process. So remember that it is an upper tier municipality COVID symptom tracking. We'll have to like remind you of these things as we go through the poll. Scenario B is a larger municipality. This is a mid-sized city. Population, is approximately 120,000. The city has around 700 employees. And in this case, the triggering context is a digital transformation mandate coming from mayor and council. So you'll see that the two scenarios are quite different. All right, so what I will do over to all of you is go to this webpage. So this is the poll we're going to be running. If you can go back to menti.com, enter this code. I will wait like, I don't know, 15 seconds to give people or give folks the time to log in.
And yeah, while we're waiting, the next stage that we're moving into within this webinar is the actual characteristics that we've outlined for a digital capacity assessment. And so if we look at, we've examined what the trigger is. So in scenario A, the trigger is a mandate, but a need to digitize. So it's a specific problem that needs to be addressed. And then scenario B, the trigger is the mandate from mayor and council, but it's not around a specific problem. It's creating digital transformation in general or a strategy. So very different triggers. And then, so what we're thinking of is like, let's apply these different characteristics to these very distinct scenarios to demonstrate the need for a capacity assessment that infuses context and trigger into its assessment and is based on that, rather than being just a broad, this characteristic and what is your level of capacity in this characteristic. It's what is your level in this characteristic and how important is that based on the scenario and the context that you're operating within.
Great, thanks, Merlin. Okay, so we're going to flip over to the first characteristic, which is user-centric. So this one is fairly straightforward. It's about building with, not for. It's grounded in principles of user research, user testing, getting out of the building, and actually talking to the people impacted by, a public service, a product, a policy, a program, to seek out and better understand how to make these services like more accessible, more responsive, more available, more intuitive, and just more human in general. Let's move on to the next characteristic. Merlin, go ahead.
Yeah, so the next one is working in the open. And this is, there's room for this characteristic to be refined. We go back and forth on what it means and what it encompasses. But really working in the open is about showing your work before it's finished and allowing for input as it's evolving. So what does that mean? It's not necessarily open source, though including open source language within procurement and partnership agreements can be advantageous. It means that there's clear, relevant, and accessible standards for opening and sharing data. There's a focus on data governance, public servants receiving ongoing training about privacy and security considerations, but have some autonomy over decisions. And I think one of the biggest challenges we see, both of our organizations being intermediaries and working adjacent to public sectors, the collaboration between government and non-governmental institutions is really hindered by the inability of government institutions to work on common platforms. So to be able to share or work on G Suite or similar platforms. Definitely not a Google advocate here, but just things that have some ability for collaboration and the lack of permissions.
So this third characteristic we call establishing multidisciplinary teams. So that essentially means teams composed of members that come from a variety of different skill sets and backgrounds. You can think of it as like, folks from IT, folks from business, folks from policy. In the world of technology development, this is very common when you work in Scrum teams or Agile teams. There will often be a team of web developers, a team of designers, and then a team of like product managers, all kind of working together as a unit. So this one is a big question for smaller governments because it means, creating, not only like hiring these roles, but also like oftentimes creating these rules, especially like, user researchers or designers, which may not already exist in the public sector or in that organization. So in the early stages of this digital characteristic, like establishing multidisciplinary teams, we can imagine we might find just cross-departmental initiatives or like, unit collaborations that kind of utilize various skill sets of existing staff, again, kind of coming from different departments or different functions. And sometimes these collaborations can be ad hoc, but in more established digital environments, especially those kind of digital service teams, they really are the norm.
Yeah, so iterative development. I mean, we've talked about this a little bit, but working in short sprints and iterations, building modules, allowing for faster feedback and iteration when necessary. What I guess the important piece is allowing for new teams or new ideas to influence the direction of the products and not mandating or not getting stuck in long-term contracts that for proprietary solutions that can't be expanded or built as context changes. And I think in this one of the things that we've seen is that early indications of this as an emerging characteristic is when product roadmaps are used outside of the IT departments and procurement contracts are scoped as iterative projects that line up to an internal roadmap. So just as an example.
Maybe just to continue on through the other characteristics, just quickly, evidence informed. This is another one of basically like data-driven decision-making. So, leadership has kind of realistic demands for data that actually informs like planning and budgeting processes and major decisions. Data collection itself is done frequently and is transparent and and teams are able to rapidly analyze data and then respond to that data within both like short-term and long-term outcomes of their projects and programs and services. And Merlin, do you want to cover the last one?
Yeah, and this is a new one for us that we're thinking about, and comes out of a lot of our recent experiences. The ability to both govern with and govern for new technologies, and so that means that aligning the use of AI with open and transparency, accountability principles, and knowing how to and when to invest in it. So this doesn't mean that a part of being or a part of digital transformation is that all cities need to use AI, employ virtual reality for their service delivery, and collect data through Internet of Things. It means that they need to know how to govern for it, and if they are going to integrate it, how to regulate it in the best interest of the public. When we look at how our digital capacity assessment is going to roll out and be advantageous to municipalities that we're interacting with. One of the things we want to do is identify how digital they need to be. And so as you know, as we asked you through the polling questions, where do they need to sit on, like, so thinking about the trigger, thinking about the scope and scale and context, where does investment in digital transformation make the most sense? Where is going to be the best return on investment and the most effective? And that is the internal capacity, and then the ability to work or collaborate or contract with external capacity. And so we look at this upper tier municipality COVID tracking. Largely, they need to be able to collaborate, because it's not necessarily going to make a whole lot of sense to build up a digital team internally when they are working with 5 to 9 lower tier municipalities. That digital team is not going to be able to cover all that context. But if we're saying largely you need to be collaborative, there needs to be a little bit higher capacity and the ability to use evidence and collect data for how things are working, and so that the process can be iterative based on that data. But within this one, it's a very specific problem, so the needs around emerging tech are sort of unnecessary at this point. It's not a consideration, so that can be shelved for another time. So this is all just a visual practice. Don't hold us to these lines. It just was to show how in this process we would outline sort of our suggestions as to where to invest in capacity development.
All right. Okay, so for those of you who have been able to stick around, thank you so much for joining. As I mentioned a bit earlier, now is our call out for you to reach out to us. So this is a learning journey for all of us, but certainly for Merlin and I to understand your needs within your team and public sector organization better, to understand kind of the challenges and context that you face, and to inform kind of this central point of truth, or at least a central understanding of how digital you need to be, especially for these resource constrained governments. So yeah, so that's it. The link again for this sign up form is in the chat. Otherwise, thank you for joining us today. That was we had a lot of fun.